It was one of those bustling afternoons at a downtown pharmacy where life moved in a rhythm of impatience and indifference. People stood in line clutching prescriptions, their eyes fixed on their phones or watches, every second spent waiting measured like an inconvenience. Among them was a young boy no older than 12, thin, barefoot, his clothes modest but neatly pressed. In his small hands he held a wrinkled prescription and a few crumpled bills. His eyes darted between the pharmacist and the labels on the shelves as he waited for his turn. Standing a few feet behind him was a man in an expensive tailored suit, a gold watch gleaming under the store's bright lights, a millionaire by reputation and appearance. He looked at the boy with a smirk that mixed amusement with mild annoyance. When the boy's turn came, he stepped forward and spoke softly to the pharmacist. The man behind the counter asked a few questions, but the boy seemed confused. The pharmacist repeated the question in English, a little louder this time, as though volume could substitute for understanding. The boy hesitated, struggling to find words. Then in a clear, trembling voice, he said, "I translate this for my mother's medicine." The pharmacist nodded sympathetically and began explaining in simpler words, while the boy repeated them in his native language, carefully, word by word, translating the instructions that would ensure his sick mother took her medication correctly. His small voice trembled slightly as he did so, but every syllable was deliberate, filled with care and concentration. The millionaire, standing in line, chuckled under his breath. To him, the scene looked almost absurd. A barefoot boy playing translator in a place surrounded by wealth, privilege, and education. He leaned slightly toward another customer and whispered something that drew quiet laughter. The boy heard it, his cheeks reddened, but he kept translating, his focus unshaken. When he finished, he thanked the pharmacist with both hands, clutching the medicine like something sacred. He counted his coins again before paying and turned to leave, his head lowered, avoiding the stares of those who had been watching. The millionaire couldn't resist one last remark. "You could have just learned English, boy," he said with a smirk. "Might save you the trouble next time." A few people smiled faintly, not out of cruelty but out of habit, mirroring the reaction of a man they assumed deserved respect. The boy stopped in his tracks. His small fingers tightened around the medicine packet. Then, without turning fully, he looked back and said quietly, "My mother can't read any language, so I read for her." The words hung in the air heavier than anyone expected. The boy bowed slightly and walked out into the sunlight, disappearing through the glass doors. For a long moment, no one said anything. The millionaire's grin faded as quickly as it had appeared. What had seemed like a harmless joke suddenly felt like a reflection of something shallow within him, something unkind he hadn't realized had grown over the years. The boy's words echoed in his mind, not because they were spoken with defiance, but because they carried an honesty that stripped away every layer of pride he wore like armor. In that instant, he remembered his own childhood, how he had once struggled to help his mother when she fell ill, how poverty had once been their daily companion. He had promised himself that wealth would erase all traces of that struggle, and perhaps it had, but in doing so, it had also erased his empathy. The laughter he shared with strangers moments earlier now felt like noise he couldn't stand. He turned his eyes toward the counter, watching the pharmacist who had served the boy. "Do you know him?" he asked. The pharmacist nodded. "He comes once a month. His mother's very sick. The boy does everything for her. He doesn't buy sweets, toys, or anything for himself. Only her medicine." The millionaire stood there quietly, his mind replaying every second of what had just happened. He walked out of the pharmacy slowly, his car gleaming by the curb, a symbol of everything he had worked for. But as he opened the door, his reflection in the tinted glass didn't look the same. He wasn't seeing success anymore. He was seeing distance, the distance between who he had become and who he used to be. He sat inside for a few moments, his fingers tapping against the steering wheel, before turning the key in silence. Down the street, he saw the boy crossing the road, the small paper bag clutched close to his chest as if it were made of gold. The millionaire followed at a distance, curiosity mingled with guilt. The boy entered a narrow alley, walked up a set of cracked stairs, and disappeared into a dimly lit doorway. The man parked his car and got out. He hesitated before following, unsure of what he was doing but compelled by something deeper than logic. Through the open window of a small apartment, he saw the boy kneeling beside an old woman lying on a bed. She coughed weakly as the boy smiled, showing her the medicine, explaining every instruction in the same gentle tone he had used in the pharmacy. Her tired eyes brightened at his words. The millionaire stepped back, feeling an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. In that small room, with peeling walls and a broken fan, he saw more love, more purpose, than he had in all the grand places his money had taken him. He returned to his car and sat silently, the city noise around him fading into a blur. The boy's voice still echoed in his head. I translate this for my mother's medicine, and he realized that what the boy had done wasn't just translation. It was devotion, an act of love that didn't seek recognition or reward. It was pure intention, something money could never buy. He thought of how often he'd mistaken intelligence for value, language for worth, and wealth for superiority. Yet here was a child who had none of those privileges, teaching him more about humanity than years of success ever had. The arrogance that had made him laugh moments earlier now felt hollow. The people he had influenced, the businesses he had built, all of it seemed smaller in comparison to a boy's simple act of care. He began to see that true wealth wasn't measured by possessions or status, but by empathy, by the ability to feel for another without judgment or pride. The encounter had started as something trivial, a rich man amused by a poor boy, but it had become a mirror, forcing him to confront the emptiness behind his laughter. Every coin that boy had counted carried more meaning than the millions he spent without thought. Every word the boy translated carried more sincerity than the empty pleasantries exchanged at his high-end meetings. It was a moment that peeled away his arrogance, layer by layer, leaving only humility and awareness in its place. The boy's voice was small, almost fragile, yet it carried a weight that silenced the laughter around him. When he said he was translating for his mother's medicine, the room seemed to shift. The arrogance that had once filled the air dissolved into a heavy stillness, and for the first time people really looked at him, not as a poor child, not as a spectacle of pity, but as someone who embodied something they had forgotten. His words were simple, but within them was a story of responsibility and love far beyond his years. He wasn't just speaking to the pharmacist. He was speaking through the layers of class, privilege, and indifference that often separate people. His tone was calm, respectful, without anger or shame, and that calmness struck deeper than any rebuke could. In a world where loudness often commands attention, this quiet act of devotion became louder than anything else in the room. The millionaire, who had been the loudest moments earlier, now found himself speechless. The echo of his laughter mocked him, bouncing inside his mind like a reminder of how easily cruelty can hide behind amusement. The boy's voice, trembling but steady, carried the weight of a truth he had long ignored. It reminded him that there are people who live not for comfort or luxury, but for love, for duty, for the simple desire to care for someone who once cared for them. Watching the boy walk out of the pharmacy, the millionaire felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. Guilt, perhaps, or maybe admiration, a recognition of purity in a world that had long taught him to value everything but that. He had built empires, spoken to powerful men, controlled markets. Yet here he was, undone by a child's simple sentence. That night, as he sat in his lavish home surrounded by quiet wealth, he couldn't shake off the boy's voice. Every detail of that moment replayed in his mind. The careful way the boy repeated the pharmacist's words, the way his hands trembled slightly when he counted his money, the way his eyes softened when he mentioned his mother. It wasn't just pity he felt. It was respect. The boy had shown a kind of strength that didn't come from power or money, but from love and necessity. The millionaire realized that the boy's strength was not born of privilege, but of purpose, and that made it unshakable. He began to understand that the boy's calmness wasn't weakness. It was resilience. It was the quiet dignity of someone who has accepted hardship but refuses to let it take away his humanity. In that moment of reflection, the millionaire began to see himself differently. He thought of all the times he had dismissed people he deemed insignificant, all the moments when he had mistaken status for superiority. The boy's small act had shattered the illusion he lived in, a world where money defined worth and language defined intelligence. The boy's quiet words carried more wisdom than any business advice he had ever received. "I translate this for my mother's medicine" wasn't just a sentence. It was a philosophy, a way of living that prioritized love over pride. The millionaire realized that the boy wasn't simply translating words. He was translating emotion into action. Every syllable was a promise of care, every pause a reflection of fear that he might make a mistake that could cost his mother's health. The next day, the millionaire drove back to the pharmacy, hoping to see the boy again. The air outside smelled of rain and city dust, and as he entered, he noticed the same pharmacist behind the counter. He hesitated before speaking, unsure of how to even begin explaining what had brought him back. "The boy who came yesterday," he said quietly. "Does he come often?" The pharmacist nodded, explaining that the boy came every few weeks, sometimes with different prescriptions. "He's a good kid," the pharmacist said. "Never asks for help, just listens carefully and makes sure his mother's medicine is right." The millionaire nodded, lost in thought. He realized that while he had been chasing wealth and status, this boy had been chasing health and survival, translating not just language but hope. It humbled him to know that while he spent his nights thinking about profits, others spent theirs worrying about keeping someone alive with nothing but faith and love. Later that evening, he found himself driving through the neighborhood where he had seen the boy disappear the day before. It was a poor district, filled with narrow streets, dimly lit homes, and the faint hum of resilience that often fills places where people have little but make the most of it. He saw children playing barefoot, their laughter echoing against cracked walls, and for a moment he envied their simplicity. He spotted the boy again near a small store, holding a bottle of water and a loaf of bread. He wasn't asking anyone for help. He was just doing what needed to be done. The millionaire parked his car and watched from a distance, realizing that this boy, in his quiet struggle, had already achieved something he hadn't: purpose. As he sat there, he thought about the power of humility. He had spent his entire life believing that confidence came from domination, from being louder and more successful than others. But here was a child teaching him that true confidence could exist in silence, in kindness, in devotion that expects nothing in return. The boy had carried himself with grace, even when mocked, had answered cruelty with gentleness, and had walked away without bitterness. It wasn't a performance, it was authenticity. And authenticity, the millionaire realized, was something he had lost somewhere between ambition and arrogance. He had built an empire but forgotten how to build empathy. He had gained influence but lost innocence. Watching that boy now felt like watching the version of himself he had abandoned long ago. He wondered what it would mean to live with that kind of integrity again, to do something not because it would benefit him, but because it was simply right. The boy's quiet dignity became a mirror reflecting his own emptiness. And though the realization hurt, it also awakened something long dormant, a desire to change, to reconnect with the humanity he had traded for success. The boy had no wealth, no status, and yet he had managed to inspire change in a man who had everything. That was the power of sincerity, the power of words spoken not to impress, but to express truth. The millionaire finally understood that wisdom doesn't always come from age, nor does strength always roar. Sometimes it whispers through the voice of a child who speaks not to be heard but to be understood. And in that whisper he found a lesson that no amount of fortune could ever teach him. The millionaire sat in his car for a long while after the boy disappeared from sight, his mind replaying the final words that had silenced him. Something within him shifted, an unease that was neither guilt nor pity but a strange sense of awakening. He had mocked the boy out of habit, the way people often do when they feel above others, when life has pampered them long enough to forget humility. Yet what followed was not a response he could have anticipated. The boy had walked away without anger, without resentment, and that silence carried a kind of strength that disarmed every trace of pride within him. But what truly unsettled him was what he did next. Without announcing it, without anyone noticing, the millionaire returned to the pharmacy later that day and quietly spoke to the pharmacist. He asked if the boy's family needed help, if the medicines were always covered, if there was something that could be done. The pharmacist, wary but honest, explained that the boy's mother had been sick for a long time, and the child came regularly to buy her medication, using whatever little money he earned doing odd jobs. The millionaire nodded, listening carefully, his expression no longer that of a man who looked down on the world, but of someone rediscovering what it meant to care. When he left, he didn't call for attention or credit. He simply instructed the pharmacist to put all of the woman's medical expenses under his name, indefinitely. He didn't want the boy to know, at least not yet. He didn't want the gratitude. He wanted the gesture itself to mean something. For the first time in years, he found himself doing something that had no return, no profit, no recognition. And in that simplicity, he felt something unfamiliar: peace. That evening, as the city lights flickered on and people hurried home, the millionaire sat by his window staring at the skyline. It looked different now. The glittering towers he once admired seemed less impressive, almost hollow. His mind wasn't on business meetings or investments anymore. It was on a small boy with a bag of medicine and a voice that had exposed his arrogance. That child had carried more strength in his humility than he ever had in his wealth. The irony struck him deeply. Over the following weeks, the pharmacist kept the arrangement quietly. Each time the boy came, the medicines were ready, the cost already covered. At first, the boy tried to pay, but the pharmacist smiled and told him the prices had been lowered by a new program. The boy believed it and continued his routine, grateful but unaware of the hand that now guided him from a distance. Meanwhile, the millionaire found himself changing in ways he couldn't explain. The laughter that once came easily to him now required sincerity. The people he once surrounded himself with, those who flattered him for his money, no longer entertained him. He began visiting hospitals and pharmacies, not as a benefactor but as a quiet observer, watching how people struggled, how they cared for one another despite having so little. It humbled him more than any lecture or sermon could have. One afternoon, he saw the boy again. This time, the child looked a little older, though only a few months had passed. He walked with the same sense of purpose, his eyes steady, his steps small but determined. The millionaire followed him discreetly, ending up once again near that same narrow alley. The boy went inside his home, and through the half-open door, the millionaire caught sight of him feeding his mother soup, patiently helping her sit up, his small hands supporting her fragile frame. He could hear their faint conversation, the woman's weak voice expressing gratitude, the boy's cheerful reassurance that she would get better soon. It was a tender, ordinary moment, but it struck the millionaire harder than any grand gesture ever had. Here was love in its purest form, silent, unpolished, constant. He turned away, feeling his throat tighten. That night he sat down and wrote a letter. In it he thanked the boy, though the boy would never know it came from him. He wrote about how a single act of sincerity could heal more than medicine ever could, how kindness from the heart could save not only others but also those who had forgotten how to feel. He signed it anonymously and left it with the pharmacist, asking it to be given to the boy one day when the time was right. It was not an apology. It was a confession of realization. Months passed, and with every passing day, the millionaire felt lighter. He began diverting his wealth toward helping others quietly, families who couldn't afford medicine, children who couldn't study because they had to work. The laughter that once mocked now came from a place of genuine joy. He had not only changed his habits, but also his heart. People around him noticed the difference, but didn't understand it. How could they? They hadn't heard the words that had changed him. They hadn't seen the look in that boy's eyes, the quiet determination born not from privilege, but from love. One morning, he received a letter from the pharmacist. Inside was a small note written in a child's handwriting. It said, "Thank you for helping us, whoever you are. My mother is feeling better now. I will work harder so I can one day help others the way you helped us." There was no name on it, but he knew immediately who had written it. He read the note again and again, each word dissolving years of arrogance and loneliness that wealth had built around him. For the first time in his life, he felt proud not of his fortune, but of what it had finally been used for. He never met the boy again. Life went on, but something had been permanently altered. The memory of that afternoon at the pharmacy became a turning point he carried forever, a reminder that compassion can come from the most unexpected places. The millionaire understood now that life has a way of humbling those who forget where they came from, of reminding even the richest man that true worth isn't measured in possessions, but in purpose. He had spent years chasing admiration, yet the moment that gave him the deepest sense of fulfillment was the one where no one was watching. The boy had given him that gift unknowingly, the chance to feel human again. The irony was poetic. The child who had once been mocked for not speaking fluent English had taught a man fluent in the language of power how to speak the language of the heart. And that lesson stayed with him, echoing quietly through every good deed he performed thereafter. The world outside remained noisy, filled with pride and competition, but within him there was stillness. He had learned that humility doesn't come from losing wealth. It comes from gaining perspective. And sometimes it takes a boy translating medicine for his mother to remind a man that the truest translations in life are not between languages, but between souls.